Okay. Okay, everyone, good evening. It's happening now. It's good to see you all. Welcome to Camden's COP26 event. My name is Harold Garner. I'm the head of sustainability at Camden. It's a celebration for COP, but also of climate action across Camden and London. It's obviously great to see so many people here, face to face, first time in a long time, after all the lockdowns and virtual meetings. I think it's good for us all, isn't it, to see each other again, so welcome. I'm not sort of surprised that there are so many faces here because climate action, the climate crisis, I know has been at the forefront of people's minds in Camden during the pandemic. And you'll hear this evening a lot about how community groups have continued to take climate action throughout the pandemic, often in ways that have actually helped communities to address some of the issues that the pandemic has posed for them. So, you know, you'll hear a lot more about that later on. I don't want to thank too many people quite yet. I'll come to that at the end, but I would like to thank Grace in particular, who is doing the signing. So this is Grace here. She's pretty amazing. So she will, yes, take a round of applause. Thank you. And I'm just going to compare tonight. So the evening will begin shortly with a welcome from Councillor Georgia Gould, who's the leader of Camden Council and the chair of London Councils. We're going to test Samsung's technology to the hilt because she's being dialed in from Glasgow. And then we will move on to hear from Councillor Adam Harrison, who's the Cabinet Member for a Sustainable Camden. And he will talk about Camden's Climate Action Plan and the first year of progress. We launched the Climate Action Plan in the middle of the pandemic in June 2020, so you'll hear from him. And after that, we will then have a short break. There will be a film put up of Camden's citizen panel, some of whom are here tonight. Now, the citizen panel was formed after our citizens' assembly. We held the first citizens' assembly on the climate crisis in Camden. And the citizen panel helps the council to sort of track the progress of the Climate Action Plan, and there are a few of the panel members here tonight. So you'll just hear a short film and their thoughts about climate action in Camden and beyond. We're then going to welcome Ebony Holland, who's the Nature Climate Policy Leader at the International Institute for Environment and Development, who is also dialing in from COP. So fingers crossed, Samsung will have that one covered. And she's going to talk about climate justice and nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. And then the event will change tack a bit, and we're going to have a panel discussion, which will be organized around the 4 COP26 themes of mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. I won't introduce you to the panelists yet because they're going to be introduced to you later by Chandrima Padmanabhan, who is here today to help with that, and she's from the Centre for Public Impact. And you'll be able to ask panel questions of the panel too, so feel free to join in. And then once you've had your fill of listening, you can then get your fill of food and drink. So we've got some really good food over there, which you may have already had a bit of a dip into. And during that, we will have a slideshow exhibition of climate action across London. So there'll be a series of slides sweeping through this screen here that will really just showcase climate action projects around Camden and beyond. So take a chance to look at those in some detail. There are also a few stalls around afterwards. We have Global Generation and the Energy Garden in particular here, and Power Up North London too. And so visit the stalls, and most importantly, try and get involved with what they've got to offer, because there are some good offers there. And then the event will close. So I think at that point, we will hopefully jump across to Georgia Gould in Glasgow.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you virtually. Very jealous to hear about all the food and drink at the event. I can see lots of friends, but only the backs of your head. So it's lovely to see those. And as Howard said, I'm in Glasgow. I'm in Glasgow Town Hall. You can see the lovely wallpaper behind me, and it's been a kind of full-on couple of days at COP, and I know all of us were. You know, there's a lot of expectation and hope around this global conference, and we're all calling on global leaders to step up and to keep our hopes of 1.5 alive and to deal with the huge crisis, the existential crisis we face. But as borough leaders, as communities, as cities, we're not waiting for them to do that. And I think I'm here with partly in my Camden role, partly as chair of London Councils, with London and 12 cities around the UK who've come together to launch a climate investment commission, which is a bold action plan to ensure that all of our major cities in the UK become zero carbon cities. It's got big price tag. £206 billion will be required to do the scale of work that's necessary to invest in renewable energy, to insulate our homes, to invest in new forms of transport. But it can be done. And I think the powerful thing for me is that we have come together as cities with an action plan, with an ask of central government, but also the private sector. And there's been huge interest. Today is Private Finance Day at COP, and real interest in the work that we're doing as cities and looking at ways that we can bring more private money into to meeting the scale of the challenge. And the kind of the money that's being talked about, the big plans, will only be real in our communities and in the work that we do together. So I think the conversation that you're having tonight is in many ways the most important, because it's the real work that's going to be happening. And what's come out of the Climate Investment Commission shows that the only way to really achieve net zero is to take a proper place-based approach, to bring all those different factors together, community action and changes to people's lifestyles, supporting the infrastructure around that. So new cycle routes, new places to support active transport, areas that create a return on investment like solar panel, alongside things that are much harder to fund, like insulation, changing our homes so that they are net zero, but even just as importantly, that they reduce fuel poverty. And that figure I gave you was for all of those cities together. The London figure is £98 billion. But the upside of that is that it would create over 1 million jobs. So it's a kind of transformative impact. And I think often when we talk about the climate crisis, there's the fear of what's happening and the impact we're already seeing, flooding in London, and as a global community, we see devastating impact in other parts of the world. But I think that the other side of that is, if we do take the action that's required, we will have a transformed society where people will experience cleaner air, better jobs, better quality of life, more services close to where they live, better quality food. And I think working together to imagine that better future is the real power we can lead as communities and as Camden. So I know that we're going to hear a lot, and Adam will talk more about the Camden journey, but I just wanted to reflect briefly on the last few years since we declared a climate emergency and decided to hold a citizens' assembly. And the citizens' assembly in Camden was on the climate crisis was one of the most powerful things that I've experienced. And the kind of energy and passion of our citizens and our young people was enormous. And all those recommendations have formed the basis of our climate action plan. But I do remember being in that room and a lot of people saying, well, how do we know that you will follow through, that these recommendations will be listened to? And one of them was to put in place a citizens panel, which would hold the council to account on the promises we've made. So it's brilliant to hear that members of that citizens panel are here today. And I think what we saw after the Citizens' Assembly was an outpouring of community action, whether it's young people organising clothes swaps, tenants working on and clubbing together to do gardening around green meadows, whether it's people setting up food co-ops with food that would otherwise have been wasted, tree giveaways. I've still got a tree growing in my garden from one of the Camden Forest initiatives. I think every pocket of Camden people have come together to take action, and that has been so powerful to see, and I think the real leadership is being shown by community. So I really wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone in this room that's been part of that journey. And it's equally important that we as a council, but also the businesses, the institutions in Camden are doing everything in our power to address the climate emergency. And I know Adam will talk about some of the interventions we're making already. And, you know, we've come a long way in reducing our carbon footprint in Camden, but the scale of the emergency means we have to push ourselves to go further, to find new ways of taking action and new ways of financing it. And Camden's Renewal Commission, which is supporting our recovery from COVID, has the climate crisis at its heart. And one of the initiatives we're working on is launching a climate bond for Camden, which will allow citizens in Camden to invest in meeting the climate emergency. And we will be working alongside anyone who wants to be part of a solution, and that's why the work we're doing here, the partnerships with Glasgow, with Bristol, Liverpool, Manchester, are so powerful, because you know, Camden is one place, but if we put all those places together, I think from the bottom up we can really lead transformative change. So I'm so excited to hear what happens at the conference today, and I'm just so grateful for everything everyone's doing, and I will try and tell the story of what Camden's doing and to push as hard as I can at COP for huge scale action on this huge challenge. I think am I handing over to Adam to talk more about the work we're doing in Camden.
Thank you, Georgia. I will now invite up to the stage Councillor Adam Harrison, the Cabinet Member, who will talk a bit about our climate action plan. Adam, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, and great to see so many people here. I'm Adam Harrison. I'm a councillor in Camden, representing the beautiful ward of Bloomsbury, and I have the great privilege to be overseeing our environmental work, including climate action. I'm very pleased to be welcoming you all here to Camden's COP26 event. We know that the climate emergency is an escalating reality, that we need to do all we can to try to avert it. And we've already heard from George a bit about the work that's been taking place here in Camden. We declared a climate and ecological emergency. We set up the Citizens' Assembly in 2019, where 50 Camden citizens gave up their time to come together and deliberate about what needs to be done, and make the 17 recommendations, which we then incorporated directly into our climate action plan, which we adopted last year. I should say last year's climate action plan wasn't the start of our work on this. Back in 2010, we introduced a plan called Green Action for Change, which has helped lead to some of the progress we made in Camden. I think it's 43% across the borough and 51% in our own estate. I'm going to shout out to Councillor Angela Mason, who's here, and she led. I think she may have been the first dedicated cabinet member for sustainability. That was something very important to us, and she kicked off that work and is now doing brilliant work overseeing our schools. And I heard about the schools climate summit this afternoon, and I came in early and there was so much huge energy from people who've been, and so I'm really glad that took place today, and there's going to be more work coming out of that. So thank you to everyone who took part in that. But since the launch of last year's plan, you may have seen the streets of Camden have been changing somewhat in certain places. We've been taking action to try and keep people safe during COVID, but also to decarbonise how we travel, and that's a really important part of the climate action plan. So we've doubled the length of safe segregated cycle lanes. We've introduced new healthy school streets to clean up the air around schools and encourage people to travel differently. We've also introduced road closures in residential areas to keep that running up, but again to bring about changes in behaviour. The number of trees that we're planting in the borough is rising. Now, I definitely know that that is not the solution to the whole climate crisis, but it is an important part, and it's something we all want to do more on. So we've raised our ambition on trees. We used to plant 400 a year. We're now aiming to plant 600 a year. We met that 2 years ago. Last year, 579 new replacement trees in the borough, which I'm very proud of, and thank the officers for leading on that work. Our street lamps are changing, you may have seen. It's probably not terribly obvious, but we're replacing all our street lamps with LED, which saves carbon and saves money, and that's been a really big project, again, undertaken by the council's team at the height of a pandemic, so it's a huge piece of work, and I congratulate them as well. And then just finally to say we've switched our own electricity supplies to 100% renewable energy, and that's been in place for a year now, so that's for our own estate. More good news last week. You may know the neighbourhood of Somerstown, just between here and Euston, really fantastic part of Camden. We were very pleased to learn from Sadiq Khan that Somerstown has been awarded funding to become a future neighbourhood. So one of only 2 in London, and we're going to be bringing in all sorts of new changes to work out how to live in a changing climate, and it's all about adaptation as well as carbon reduction. So we're again going to be introducing active travel measures, retrofitting, greening Somerstown, introducing a circular economy market as well. So there's huge excitement around that, and huge community energy in Somerstown. And I would say that the residents and the community groups in Somerstown were an absolutely crucial part of us formulating that bid and being successful in it, because as we've heard, we can only do this and meet this challenge if it's all of us working together. Just finally, I would just urge any businesses, third sector organisations, schools as well, to join the Camden Climate Change Alliance. You can see their logo just behind me. This is an organisation we run which can advise on all these organisations on how to cut their carbon. We've introduced the Camden Climate Pledge, which we'd also urge organisations to sign up to, because we know how important the role of business is in this challenge. So I hope what you see tonight will inspire further action. We're going to be celebrating the action that everybody is already taking and thinking about how we can go further. So thank you for coming. Thank you to our hosts, Samsung, for hosting us in this fantastic venue. And I hope you enjoy the evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Harrison. So, yeah, we're now going to move into this film that I was discussing from the citizen panel members. Who are the citizen panel members in the room? I think I can see a couple of you. Do you want to put your hands up? Yeah, there they are. 2 of them. 3. 3 of them, yeah. 4. Hello. So there are quite a few of them here. So this is a film about their work, and I'll just leave it to, it's pretty self-explanatory. Here it is.
I think Camden's an amazing place to live. It's an amazing place to work. It's a very wealthy borough. Everybody wants, all the businesses want to come to Camden. We've got Google, we've got Facebook, they're all moving. And I think we have the opportunity in Camden to trailblaze, to lead in terms of our efforts in terms of sustainability. I did join the Camden Solar Together initiative, and I've installed about 10 or 12, I can't remember now, a couple of years ago, panels on the roof. Camden had pre-selected contractors and had all of the processes in place, so it wasn't such a scary process to go through.
I stopped eating meat. I just whittled it back, actually, until my cupboards and my freezer no longer had any animal products whatsoever. This is me saying that I mean what I'm saying. I want to make a contribution to not have our world end in disaster. And if I scaled that right back to me, then what can I do?
I think the first thing is to make sure you feel as informed as you need to be about the climate emergency. You know, if there's something you don't quite understand about, why recycling is a good thing, or what might happen if you do nothing, or why people are being encouraged to go vegan or whatever, take a little bit of time, do that little bit of research, whether it's talking to people you know or looking online or whatever, and then decide what you're going to do for yourself or what you're going to do for your family or your future generations.
You think about your day-to-day shopping, think about what you spend, how you spend it, what you're buying, you know, whether it's all plastic. You know, for me, it was just step by step. You think about one thing, then you add another, and that's all it comes down to, just thinking about what can you do to make that change.
I really believe that the environment that we live in affects who we are and the way we are with each other. So particularly being a long-term Camden resident, the opportunity to be on the panel and to try and engage with the process of making Camden that much more sustainable.
Being a part of the Citizens Climate Panel has really helped me see that I do have a voice and I can use it, and it is listened to. And it's such an important issue that even if it's not immediately affecting me now, it could well do in the future.
I'm also really excited about what we can do locally within Camden. I think that's both at a council level and at an individual level.
It needs to be about businesses, it needs to be about corporations and the way that they behave. They will lead and consumers will follow, is the way it ought to be. But if consumers have to lead, then trust me, business will follow.
I think just like young people in general have really led the way on this, like really recognizing how much of a crisis it is, and how much like short-sighted politics isn't going to get us anywhere. Like we need to think about future generations, we need to think about our grandchildren's grandchildren.
It's to have the conversation, tell other people what I'm doing, and hopefully encourage and inspire them to do something themselves.
Think twice before you buy it, whether it's a car or groceries wrapped in plastic. Think twice before you buy it.
You need to have groups where you can just like be able to face the reality of it, like with people. I think that's why like organisations and groups and activism is so important. And there's just so much stuff going on locally in Camden, like so many groups that need volunteers. But ultimately, the biggest difference we can make is by forcing our governments and our public institutions to like get this under control. And I think that's the biggest influence you can have as an individual, is to join up with other people.
We can all take a stand for something, whether it's equality, whether it's good health and well-being, sustainable cities, climate or air pollution. Let's all think about where we might contribute, whether it's using our time, our expertise or donating our skills. Where can you make a difference?
So, yeah, a big thank you to our citizen panel. They've been really incredibly helpful in the development of and the delivery of Camden's Climate Action Plan over this first year. And the Climate Action Plan's first annual review will be published later this month. And a big thank you to the panel for all their contributions. So, thank you. We're now going to move on to Ebony Holland, who is the Nature Climate Policy Lead at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Ebony has a strong background in public policy strategy and advocacy related to climate change, nature and sustainable development. She designs and coordinates the IIED's strategy to shape and promote a climate, nature and sustainable development agenda at international policy forums. And indeed, she is dialing in from COP. So hopefully we can just move across to Ebony. Hi, Ebony. Welcome.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Amazing. Awesome. A very good evening to everyone from chilly Glasgow. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really fantastic to join this event hosted by Camden Council and to connect with the great work of many of you, including through the Camden Climate Change Alliance. And that video was just fantastic. Congratulations to everyone involved. As has already been said, my name is Ebony Holland and I'm the Nature Climate Policy Lead at the International Institute for Environment and Development, or IIED as we're more widely known. I'm Australian, as you may have picked up from the accent, but I moved to the UK last year for my second stint here, and it's a real pleasure to virtually be joining you for this event this evening. Very proud to be giving this keynote address, so thank you very much for the opportunity. IIED is really proud to call the Borough of Camden Council our home. We've been working here for many years, and while our work has an international focus, My colleagues and I, we all play, work, some of us live in the Camden Council area, and it's really fantastic to be able to see the progress being made on climate action through the efforts of many here today. I am joining you from the official Blue Zone at COP26 up here in Glasgow. We've just had 2 days of Leaders Summit statements and meetings, as you'd be hearing through the media and various other channels. There's more than 25,000 people registered to attend. It's just a massive undertaking and also an honour to be up here as well. Many can't be here, which is part of the challenges with doing this during a pandemic. I have found possibly the quietest part of the whole zone that I can. I'm in a green telephone box. I feel like a sustainable Doctor Who, or maybe a cyborg with this headset on. So hopefully you're not getting too much background noise. The negotiations have just broken for a bit of a break before the evening session. So there's quite a few people walking behind me, I think on their way to grab some food. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you specifically about climate justice. It's an area that my organisation and many others here at this event today will be very passionate about and is absolutely central to climate change. I'm going to first talk about what it is we mean when we talk about climate justice and why it matters, including globally, which is what I work on, but also here in the UK and in the Camden Council area. I'll then touch on why climate justice is so important to outcomes at COP26, and I'll indicate some of the issues for everyone to keep an eye on over the coming fortnight, including on climate mitigation, climate finance, and driving more locally led climate action. So what is climate justice and why does it matter? Why are we talking about it here tonight? One of the fundamental truths of the climate crisis is that countries and people who have done the least to create the climate crisis in general are being hit hardest by its effects. And this is exactly where climate justice or the climate injustice emerges. Those who are suffering have done the least to cause it. Science shows us that many of the poorer countries, particularly in the tropics or lower latitudes, will be hit far harder than richer countries in more temperate zones. And this is going to drive inequalities. This is already emerging through the disparities between rich and poorer countries. And we really need to see urgent action on climate change to really deal with these issues. When we think about climate justice, we can think about it manifesting at different levels. At IIED, we often think about it at the international level, but it equally plays out at the local and national level also. At the international level, richer countries have more resources and more tools to support adaptation and mitigation efforts and to buffer their people and economies from many of the impacts of climate change. These resources and tools that are needed at scale and not readily available to poorer countries to support their own climate efforts. They're not available to enable these countries to draw on their extensive traditional knowledge and to take the climate action that they really need to. And so this is definitely an area of injustice that we focus on. At the national and local level, power and decision-making can sometimes be exercised in ways that do not include or take account of marginalised people, for example, people living with a disability, youth, women, Indigenous peoples. If these voices, if the needs of these people are not taken into account, then this further exacerbates the cycle of marginalisation and perpetuates the injustice. For Camden specifically, and IIED is not an expert on how climate change will affect the UK, so I'm not going to credibly try and tell you and talk to you about things that you're already aware of. But what I would do is encourage you to think through what injustice means in your community. And this is relevant to you whether you're a business owner, a grassroots activist, a civil servant, a volunteer. Thinking through what climate justice means in your context and community can help you understand these issues. Thinking through what it means for vulnerable people in your neighbourhood, for new migrants that may not be familiar with the climate in your area or the seasons that we have here in the UK. Thinking through what it may mean for people that live without permanent homes, for people that live in floodplains, perhaps not so relevant, I think, for Camden, but very much relevant for bushfire zones for my local council back in Australia. Thinking through what climate change can mean for those who rely on public transport for work, for the well-being benefits we get from nature and trees in our neighbourhood, and so forth. I won't list all of it, and many of these have been touched on already by Councillor Harrison. But it's this influence of multiple stress factors, which we often call intersectionality, that is an important consideration for everyone's action on climate change, both from the international, national, and to the local level as well. We don't have enough time to go into lots of details, the depth of climate justice today, but I do want to highlight that it does also touch on issues around colonialism, around intergenerational equity, around the loss of nature, which I know that we've been talking about a little bit already tonight, around the displacement of people and climate-induced migration, and also to the ongoing impacts to culture, livelihoods and rights for Indigenous peoples and local communities, and much more. It's a very important topic, one with much depth, and very important to COP26 here. And really for us at IIED, climate justice or injustice is what really shapes our work on climate change and across our biodiversity work as well. And it's certainly shaping our efforts and our engagement here at COP26. And what I wanted to do is, in the second part of this, just talk to you a little bit about what some of the emerging areas are at COP26 to keep an eye out on that will hopefully seek to address some of the climate justice issues that we face. The concept of climate justice is, of course, front and center here, and there are a number of outcomes that we need to see that need to be much stronger. I want to put to you that there are 3 outcomes, in fact, here at COP26 that will go some way to putting us on a pathway of a more truly transformational approach that can sort of dismantle some of the systems and power structures that perpetuate the injustice of climate change. I do want to caveat by saying that there's no silver bullet. We wish there was, I'm sure many of us do. These issues won't be solved overnight, but it's important that at every COP, at every meeting, at every discussion on climate change, that we move these forward a little bit more. And I think we're starting to see a bit of that at COP26 now. So there are 3 points. The first on mitigation feels quite basic, but it is quite a monumental shift, is that we actually really need to see a recommitment from all countries to the goal of 1.5 degrees. Those involved in climate change will know that the Paris Agreement seeks to limit global warming to 2 degrees, but ideally to 1.5. One of the outcomes at COP26 is to really shift that attention to the 1.5 degree goal. The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees may seem fairly insignificant, but it can be literally, you know, a matter of survival for some communities in low-lying countries. And so there's some traction already happening for this at COP26. We saw at the weekend G20 leaders, of course, many of who are some of the world's largest emitters, are on board for a 1.5 goal, which is exciting, but we need to see this landed at COP26. And I think this will go quite some way to building trust and resetting some of the fairly low ambition in some of the country plans on climate change to date. The second point is on climate finance. Certainly from my perspective, COP for me this year is about climate finance. It's very much under the spotlight. It's one of the big priorities, and it really is about getting access to more finance to enable poorer countries to take the climate action that they need to. Securing this finance and ensuring people at the front line of the climate crisis can access it is a matter of climate justice. As we said at the start, many of the communities that require access to finance are not the communities that have contributed to climate change. And so creating a finance system that enables better flows of finance, better access down to the local level to enable these communities, like those in Camden Council even, to undertake the initiatives and the programs that they need to build their resilience is really critical. There is and has been and will be more climate finance pledges, which is absolutely fantastic. There have been some really big announcements so far, and we're only at day 3 of COP, though I think we can all agree that a promise is only a promise once it's implemented, and we really need to see how these plans will be implemented, the trajectory of these finance pledges, and really what will come next, because we need to have longer term financing to really tackle the climate crisis. The third point I will say is something that's very dear to IIED's heart, and that is really working with local partners and enabling them to undertake their own climate adaptation efforts. We're seeing really strong support at COP26 behind this effort of local and community-led climate action. I think for truly transformational climate action, we need local people, local councils, local churches and faith-based organisations, Indigenous groups, marginalised groups, grassroots, youth, we need everyone on board to help. But we need to make sure that decision making and finance is with these groups, with these people that can really take action. And so as well as having better finance, more access to it, we need to make sure it gets down to the front line so that it's there for those communities to take the action that they need. At COP26, we're seeing some really great practical movement towards this. We're seeing more and more countries, more and more finance providers moving towards a direction of enabling more locally led action, which is really exciting. And locally led action is not just in the context of climate vulnerable countries, it's as relevant in more wealthy countries as well. So those are the three things that I think we need to keep an eye out for at COP. COP is moving rapidly at the moment. There's new announcements every day. Many of them are putting us on a good pathway for tackling more this issue of climate injustice. Though, of course, we need to see more action, more promises, more collaborations, more partnerships, more action at the local level, which is why it's so fantastic to be speaking today and hearing more about what everyone is doing in the Camden Council area. I could honestly spend all night talking about climate justice. And if I were there with you in person, it would have been my pleasure to do so. But I'll leave you with this by just saying that we really are all part of this journey towards addressing climate justice and the climate crisis at large. From these big global events like COP26, where I am, to local events like yours tonight, it's really important that we keep talking about these issues, keep highlighting these issues, keep calling on, and most importantly, taking strong action on climate change. And I think if we all keep doing this together, we can absolutely turn things around and pave our way to a much more climate neutral, nature positive, and just future. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you, Ebony. That was a really insightful conversation, wasn't it, from her? Great to have someone from COP. So we're going to change tack with the event now, and Chandrima is going to step up and chair the panel discussion, which will continue the COP26 theme. So Chandrima, welcome.
And hi, everyone. It is so great to see so many of you here today. As Harold already mentioned, my name is Chandrima. I work with the Center for Public Impact, where I lead some of the work that we do on public engagement around climate change. We have a really fantastic set of panelists who will be joining us today. And so without further ado, I'll just invite them to join me here on the stage. We have Paul King, who is the Managing Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at Lend-Lease. We have Aliza Ayaz, who is a UN Goodwill Ambassador and an international climate activist. We have Benaifa Bhandari, who is the CEO of Hopscotch and the Chair of Voluntary Action Camden. And we have Ryan Jude, who is the Program Director of Green Taxonomy at the Green Finance Institute. Thanks everyone for joining us here today. And before I invite each of our panelists to sort of give a short introduction to themselves, tell us a little bit more about their work, I do want to briefly lay out the broad context of what we will be discussing in this panel discussion. So Ebony gave us a very insightful and comprehensive overview of the climate justice landscape and all of the important work that remains to be done in the climate justice space. And though as we move into this panel discussion, those are some of the themes and messages that we will be reflecting on. But we will also, alongside that, be reflecting, as Harold mentioned, on the broader COP26 goals, so looking at mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. And so over the next 60 minutes, we'll start off with a round of introductions. We'll move on to 30 minutes of Q&A, after which we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of audience questions, and then we'll have a closing round of reflections. So lots to cover, and I'm excited to get started. So let's maybe kick off with a round of introductions. Ryan, it would be great to start with you.
Yeah, thank you. So, as you've already said, I'm Ryan Jude. I'm Program Director for Green Taxonomy work at the Green Finance Institute. The Green Taxonomy is essentially a regulation that will define what our green future sustainable activities are. And in the future, financial services firms will have to report how green they are by using that dictionary. The Green Finance Institute, we are co-funded by the government and private sector, and we're very much focused on mobilising finance to real economy climate outcomes. I also lead our local climate bond campaign at the Institute, which is why I believe I've been invited here tonight, because as you heard from Georgia earlier, Camden has just committed to issue a local climate bond next year, which is incredibly exciting. I will talk more about local climate bonds later. I just want to say that I'm very excited to be here because it is Finance Day at COP. So for someone who works at the Green Finance Institute, to be here to talk about climate and finance is fantastic.
Thanks. Benaifa, on to you.
Thank you so much. I'm Benaifa Bandari, and I'm CEO of Hopscotch Women's Centre, which is a charity that's been based in Camden since World War II. And in the last couple of decades, we've focused in on supporting minoritised women and families with all the various challenges that come to them, including abuse, poverty, in-work poverty, and unemployment. So today I'm also representing Voluntary Action Camden, who I'm chair with, Global Generation, the most amazing charity that really understands climate locally and globally and just are around the corner and have a stand here, and I'm chair for them. I'm also a trustee with C4, and I'm a member of Climate Emergency Camden. It's too many. And I was so touched by what Ebony said because, she said it all, and all I can share with you later is what we do at grassroots level. Thank you.
Thanks, Benaifa. Eliza.
Hi, everyone. The mic. Hello? Hello?
Nope.
It is on from here. Hello?
You're going to have to shout.
I'm happy to shout. Oh, it's working now.
It's working.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's great to see this turnout. My name is Eliza Ayaz. I'm a United Nations Goodwill Ambassador. I'm the youngest United Nations Goodwill Ambassador, which comes with a lot of responsibility. I was appointed this position in recognition of my work for health and climate, and I specifically cater to SDG 13, tackling climate change urgently. I'm also chairperson at an international NGO that I founded while I was a student at University College London. It's called Climate Action Society, short for CAS. And what we do there is we have all kinds of things, from climate education to sustainable fashion shows. The idea is that it's a youth-led organization for the youth with zero budget, and we're here to show how things are done.
Thanks, Eliza. Paul.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be here. Paul King, as you can see up there, I work for Lendlease. I'm the big bad property developer on the panel. I'm here to try and persuade you that there are a few developers who actually are committed to sustainable development, including Argent, of course, responsible for the regeneration of King's Cross. I've been working in sustainability and climate action for the last 25 years or so. I worked for many years for WWF, formerly the World Wildlife Fund, where, amongst other things, I ran a campaign called 1 Million Sustainable Homes 20 years ago now, campaigning for zero carbon homes, first time around. And then I set up and ran the UK Green Building Council for 8 years before joining Lendlease almost 7 years ago. So Lendlease is very much committed to sustainability. It takes climate action very seriously. A year ago, we committed to be a 1.5 degree aligned company. And we've set two fairly bold targets, one to be net zero carbon by 2025, but then to be absolute zero carbon, scopes 1, 2, and 3, with no offsets and no excuses by 2040, which is a bit of a moonshot target, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you, everyone, for those introductions. I'll dive right into the Q&A, and I'll direct my questions to specific panelists, but I invite the rest to jump in if you feel you have a perspective to present or if you have a related point that you would like to make. And Benaifa, I'd love to start with you. Just drawing on your experience working on racial and gender inequality, could you tell us a little bit more about how you see how we should frame climate action through the lens of social justice?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and Camden is one of the most culturally rich boroughs in the country. It's also one of the most unequal boroughs in the whole country. Minoritized voices are so important, and when I use this word minoritized, I mean older people, younger people, the LGBT community, ethnic minoritized people, those with illnesses that are seen and unseen. Why don't we just stop for a second and look around you, and I say, use stereotypes. Look around you. How many minoritized people are represented here today? It's always the same. It's always very few. We're here because of our privilege. Even the people of color here, we've got privilege. That's why we're here. And so what we end up doing is being a little self-congratulatory and saying the same things over and over again, and nothing really changes, because the voices of those who, let's face it, are going to suffer the most with the climate crisis, they're just not around the table. And what was the question?
So how do you frame the idea or the understanding of climate action through the lens of social justice?
Yeah, social justice costs, okay? It's not for free. So this is what we need to think about. What is the government doing? How are they funding councils who can then work with organizations like the very many that I work for, and Camden is rich. We have nearly 1,500, 2,000 charities and programs in the borough alone. But they don't live off fresh air. They are the ones who have access to the minoritized communities. They can make people feel part of the problem, and they should, because they get it. When you're minoritized and you're on that intersection, you really get it. It's an easy win. There's no resistance to the goal that we're all aiming for here. So I really feel that opportunity will only come, that opportunity for change will only come when the government recognizes the importance of that investment.
Thank you. Thanks, Benaifa. Just to stay a little bit longer on this, and Eliza, I'll come to you. Could you tell us a little bit more about the different, given the work that you've done with the UN and also just as a global citizen yourself, how do we unpack the different levels and layers within climate justice, and what that looks like in different regional contexts, and what does that mean then for global action?
Is the mic working? It is. So when it comes to climate justice, there's a lot to think about. But in very simple summary, when you see devastating climate effects, whether it's hurricanes, floods, droughts, wildfires, all too often they hit areas that consist of marginalized communities, poor communities, people of color. And climate justice is actually a phrase that was coined and pioneered by activists in the global south fighting these threats in their homelands. And increasingly it's used by think tanks, NGOs, politicians, researchers who are trying to fight for climate justice and related injustices in society. I think the central argument here is, how do we fundamentally restructure society, one that is of a capitalist nature, especially in London, for example? How do we focus on technical effort to try to mitigate carbon emissions? How do we develop an approach that focuses on every individual, localizing the SDGs? And climate justice, a lot of times, shouts to one outcome, and that one outcome is often like, those rich countries and those rich corporations that have been burning fossil fuels, they should redistribute their wealth with the people and with the communities that have been affected most by climate change. And it makes me think, what about the people that are experiencing the harsh reality of climate change? These are people who are dying because of heat waves, because of droughts and floods in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, at this very moment. A lot of us were in this bubble. I was in this bubble 3 years ago. You know, I lived in Karachi, which is a very populous city, a lot like all the luxuries you have in London, and just a few miles away from me was this desert where people were dying because of effects due to climate change. And these effects of climate change were because of countries like the United Kingdom, like Russia, and the USA. So what is it that we're going to do by actually ostracizing the people who are most affected by climate change? Let's include them. So climate justice in a regional context is diverse action with diverse people.
Thanks so much, Eliza. Paul, I'd love to come to you at this point, and I do want to connect some of the dots between what Benaifa and Eliza have said as well. So I have a two-part question for you. So the first part is, what role does the private sector play in the transformation that is required to ensure that we aren't moving towards high carbon, high emissions development pathways, and we're not locking ourselves in? But also within that, what is the role of people and communities, and how do you bring that together?
Sure. As I said, I was saying to Benaifa earlier, you know, I used to work for WWF for many years, and we used to talk about working in sustainable development, and now I work for a developer. So I sometimes just as a joke, I went from working in sustainable development to working in sustainable development. And the point being that now I'm confronted with many colleagues in terms of how do you do this for real? You know, how do you do this in a really meaningful way? I've already said, you know, Lendlease is very committed to a zero carbon trajectory, and we'll be held to account for that, and we'll publish our progress on that regularly as we've just done this year. But another thing that our board did last year was they reviewed and they refreshed our sort of corporate purpose. And our corporate purpose is to create places where communities thrive. So we'll be held to account for that as well, right? So many of the projects that we work on are very large and long-term. So we're the government's partner for the overstation development of Euston, just down the road. Huge part of London, potentially an area of sort of 60 acres in central London, huge area. It's going to take a very long time to develop that project overall, probably 25 years. So we're going to be part of that community or communities for a very long time. And, you know, we've got our plans to ensure that that will be a zero carbon place. And we have also already started to think about how we will assess the designs and everything else that needs to go into that place to make sure that it's resilient to the inevitable climate change that is going to happen, that's already locked in on the basis of carbon emissions that have already occurred. So all of our projects now, we're designing and testing against a sort of worst case scenario of a 4 degrees plus temperature rise, which directly goes to what will the long-term impacts be on people. So how will people be affected by the urban heat island effect? How will people be affected by drought, by flooding in an urban context, and so on and so forth? But to make all of that meaningful, you know, we can work with engineers and scientists and all sorts of other experts. But to make it really meaningful, obviously, we've got to work with local people, you know. We're committed. We're working very closely with Camden Council and UCL on a project called Good Life Euston. We have gone out into the community with Camden and UCL to identify citizen scientists who are going to work with us to provide feedback in terms of the things that they value, the things that they need, the things that they aspire to in this place that is their home. And that will directly inform the way we go about developing that zero carbon place, so that we do create a place where these communities can thrive. I mean, just one final comment. This afternoon, colleagues and I were having a chat in one of the events being held at the Living Centre this week around climate change, and we were talking to some local people. My colleague asked one of them, you know, is climate change, is the environment top of the list? You know, it's what everybody's talking about this week. And they said, well, honestly, a couple of years ago, it would have been in the top 3, alongside jobs and housing. Now, maybe not, because jobs and housing and how they're going to put food on the table has bumped it off of that list. You know, and I think there's a lot we can reflect on from the last year or two from the pandemic, which we know has impacted the poorest and the most the people with the biggest challenges in our communities hardest, just as climate change is impacting the poorest, the most disadvantaged communities hardest. And I also think there's a lot of synergies in the way forward. You know, people are going to value green spaces, open spaces that are truly accessible, that they can share, places that bring community together, facilities that allow people to come together, and obviously employment opportunities and other opportunities for them to thrive over time. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from the last couple of years. And as I say, we're very committed to working with local people for many years to come in shaping a place.
Thanks, Paul. Ryan, over to you. And I think I've saved the most important question right for the end, which is, what is the role of private and public finance in enabling a sort of equitable transition to net zero?
Well, no pressure if you think it's the most important question. I think that often when people talk about public and private finance, they get it wrong and they frame it in the binary of public will pay for it or the private will pay for it. And there's a lot of ideology in that from people who've sided on either side of that. But the reality is that both will have a very important role to play, and we need to just make sure that they are going towards the right areas. So private finance will end up paying for the vast majority of this. That's a fact. But public finance then needs to protect the most vulnerable. We're talking about climate justice. As we're transitioning to heat pumps, retrofitting our buildings, electric vehicles in the UK, we need to have public finance supporting those that can't afford to do that to make sure that their heat bills aren't going up. So there's definitely a role for both sides of it in this debate. But both can definitely be doing more as well, which I'll come to in a second. Because the one thing that I always want to say when I talk about climate finance, finance in general, is to reframe the way we talk about it. People call it a cost. They say, how are we going to pay for net zero? People should instead be saying it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to invest in green jobs, to invest in the green economic activities of our future, and to invest in reshaping the world in a completely different way that is fairer. And that's something that we can achieve through the power of finance. And also, instead of saying pay, they should be saying fund, but that's a little bit that annoys me. In terms of the both being able to do more, so Paul's old employees at the WWF, after last year's budget, said that the UK was currently only investing about 0.01% of GDP per annum on net zero transition, when the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, said it should be 1%. So there's obviously a huge disparity there. And in the budget last week, the Chancellor didn't say the word climate once. He said the word net zero, the phrase net zero, twice in reference to the strategy, which isn't fantastic when you need to think that every single financial decision needs to be green. Whenever people talk to me about the Green Finance Institute, I always say that if we do reach net zero, we won't be called the Green Finance Institute, we'll just be the Finance Institute, because every single financial decision has to be green. Add to that a little bit, if I can go on about local climate bonds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's also really important to involve people in this, again, as everyone's been saying. So that's why the local climate bonds are so fantastic, because it's a way for residents in a local area to, through their council, invest in projects in their local area. And there's also a redistributive element to this, because the people who invest into it are those who have to be more affluent in the area, who have savings. But once they invest into the instrument and the council spends it on the public area, it becomes a public good that benefits everyone in the area. So finance is crucial. I want people to speak about it a bit differently, and local action is also important.
Great. No, thank you. I do have another question about that, though, because the local climate bond bit that you shared was very interesting. Are there other innovative sort of financial instruments that local actors should know about, that they do have access to?
There are lots. Can I talk more about local climate bonds first, though? So local climate bonds they're an innovative green finance instrument, which West Berkshire and Warrington launched the first ones last year. Residents from as little as £5 can invest into it. The key part of it is that engagement aspect, where a lot of people look at their council and they think, what do? They pick up my bins, they do a few other things. Through this, they get a buy-in to be able to see, actually, they're channeling my capital into doing something green. And across the UK now, 70% of councils have declared a climate emergency. But the question is, what do they do next? How do they take those tangible steps? And Camden is one of the best councils for this. I'm not just saying this because you're right here and you're all from Camden, but it's true. It genuinely is true. Through the Citizens' Assembly and then through announcing the climate bond recently, that's obviously fantastic to see. What was the question again?
Other innovative local financial instruments.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a big one that's been announced recently from central government is the UK Infrastructure Bank. But that's important on a local level because they've said that they will set aside capital to work with local authorities. And through the work that I do, the biggest blocker that we always find when we speak to local authorities is that they don't necessarily have the resources or the capacity to focus on specifically climate issues. There's lots of social care issues, obviously with COVID, there's lots of health issues. So the UKIB should be working closely with councils over the next few years to hopefully give them lower cost finance to help them do local infra.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just sort of to wrap this up and to talk a little bit more about, we spent some time talking about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities for different local actors working on climate action, but it would just be really interesting to hear from any one of you on what are opportunities for collaboration? How do we work across sectors, between actors, across communities? How do we bridge the divide a lot more, and how do we move forward collectively? Anyone wants to go?
I'm happy to speak on that.
Yeah.
Cross-sector collaboration, I love that. I think 3 simple facts. Cross-sector collaboration is absolutely crucial for net zero. Secondly, it's imperative, it's not optional, even now. And thirdly, strong partnerships across sectors are the only way that we can actually get the benefit and reap the benefit of climate technology, whether it's medtech or thinking very intelligently about how we're developing property, whether it's fashion or retail. Because in the end, we're talking about where power lies. It's with governments and big corporations. And how do we change the power that they have into the voices of individuals and the actions of individuals, changing that micro effect into macro effect. And the example I want to give here is something that's happening in Germany. What they're doing is something called an EEG, the German Renewable Energy Sources Act. And this is essentially a feed-in tariff scheme that demonstrates how policy and governance can promote renewables and sustainable energy. And so at COP26, we were working on how every country must have a national framework that feeds into this and relevant policies to support it. So again, it's a question of governments and multinational companies, how are they shifting the power and actually working on this? At the same time, I think NGOs play a very important role, a significant role, because they actually bring attention to the pressing needs of urgent societal matters. And then lastly, we've got the private sector. With the private sector, I think they've got 2 specific fortes. Number 1, it's communication expertise. And secondly, I think they can bridge the gap in making technology accessible to every individual, whether it's talking about smart meters in your homes, whether it's talking about modern insulation, ways to cut down carbon emissions. So you know what, I do agree with cross-sector collaboration. It is the way forward, whether it's fashion, retail, medicine, bankers, whatever profession you're from, whatever background you're from, this is the way forward.
Thanks, Elisa. Yes.
Yeah. So there's the 2 really great points of how corporates, could make a difference. And I want to add a third in a borough full of corporates is actually you don't have to do very much. Just give local organizations doing that local work money. That's what you have to do. Put your hand in your pocket and give that money, because we know how to do that work that you don't know how to do. And you know what? When you do that, don't ask for anything back. We will report to you. We will give you the budgets and we'll give you everything. But don't ask for anything back. Let me give you an example. Hopscotch, our lead partner with Camden Council, with the Afghan refugee crisis. So half of my team are in the hotels working flat out with what is an awful, awful situation there. Our corporate friends are the ones who made that happen. Within 2 weeks, I'd raised nearly £100,000 so we can really fully do this work in the scale it needs to be done. One of our friends said, I will give you a check, but before that, could you find me 5 service users who'll tell me how difficult it is to navigate around Euston Station? No, our service users are struggling to put food on the table. This is irrelevant to them. But I have got 5 staff who live locally, so they They gave their views, and I got the check. It's not right. So, you know, if there are corporates here and if there are corporates online, listen to this. You know, this is your opportunity to not be told that you're greenwashing, to make a difference. Look at what Global Generation is doing. They have fantastic partnerships with corporates because the team, the directors, they hold those corporates to account. You know? And this is why I'm so fascinated by charity infrastructure work, because I want every charity to feel that emboldened to say, give us that money, don't ask stupid questions, and we will give you the impact of the work that you've just paid for.
Thanks, Benaifer. That was, I think, the perfect note for us to end our Q&A session on and move to audience questions. We have a couple of mics that are in circulation, so if you could raise your hands if you have any questions for any of the panelists, we'll come to you. I think we have one question here on the right.
Hi, yeah, this is a really good turnout, and I totally agree with the representation for Camden being quite shocking. I think we've missed a big section of what's going on in Camden at the moment. We've talked about marginalised people, ethnic minorities, people of colour. We haven't used the working class word. You know, all these people come in a working class bracket. We haven't talked about living wage. You know, if we want to balance things out, we want to bring people into an economic environment that they can choose their energy providers, that they can insulate their buildings, that they don't have to buy cheap food. We haven't even mentioned food this evening. Food in Camden is a massive issue, people in food poverty. You know, and if we don't bring in something like a living wage or something of a circular economy within Camden, these are going to be continuing, and marginalisation is just going to be a second base word. It's actually going to become irrelevant. It's going to be used infinitum where it doesn't mean anything anymore. You know, we have a working class population in Camden. They need our support. They need more than universal credit. They need, you know, a proper wage. They need a living wage. They need to be able to afford. You know, we talk about finance and making good deals with finance companies, but actually these people shouldn't be going to finance companies and paying interest back. You shouldn't be charging our community to be able to survive. And it's a massive chunk of what people are living on in the streets. Refugee Community Kitchen, which I work with, we feed people in the street with food poverty. You know, people unemployed, people that are actually employed and still having to come and get food. The food waste in this borough is outrageous. But what's happening is the greenwashing now of food. Waste food is something we need to tackle. We need to get rid of waste and surplus food. We don't need to commodify it. And that's another thing that's happening in the big step. All of a sudden, waste food is, oh, we're giving our waste food away, so we're going to get a green tick. No, stop producing waste food. Don't use it so you can actually make a mess in the rest of your company but get a green tick because you've supplied some waste food and surplus food to a charity down the road in Camden. It's insulting. You know, we need to address basic issues. We need to give living wages. We need to make sure that our children in our borough aren't hungry. And until we can do that, we can't talk about climate. We can't talk about our energy bills. We can't talk about co-ops because people are living day to day, hand to mouth. And until we address the working class problem in Camden, then actually all of this conversation is a bit of greenwashing. There you go.
Thank you for your comments. Benaifer, if you want to share reflections.
Thank you, absolutely. And I just wanted to say that when you're talking about a living wage, you're talking about a real living wage, not London living wage. In London, the biggest cause of poverty is in-work poverty. Most people who are poor are in work. So these are their priorities. Survival is their priority. This is what needs to be changed.
Fine.
Yeah, no, just to agree with that. I mean, where I live over in Westminster, 1 in 3 children there are growing up in poverty, and half of them are in working poverty, which is obviously ridiculous. I completely agree with you. And when I'm talking about the public finance supporting people, the public purse supporting people, it is those in fuel poverty. They should not be paying interest, as you said. They should be getting support given to them to help them along this journey. And I do think, though, that the climate crisis is also an inequality crisis. So as we're looking to fund all this green stuff, at the same time, we need to be thinking, how does that also help the most vulnerable in our communities? If you're not doing that, what's the point in spending on the green stuff? Which is, I feel like we're completely in line there. On a living wage, my personal view is I would love to see that rolled out across the entire country. We get into a lot more arguments there with what the current government's going to be willing to do. But I completely hear you and agree it's a very important point that needs to be highlighted.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? We have 2. If we could take both questions and then we could respond, that would be great.
Okay, I'll go. My name is Agamemnon Otero. I've been setting up community projects across London and Camden for many years. I have a couple questions for you. One would be, Ryan, the ESG movement seems to be a lot of E and no S or G. So that just to clarify to everybody, environmental, social, and governance. And I don't think that, I'd just love to hear your opinion to the group about that. And then, Paul, the work that Lendlease is doing, I mean, through Argent and all the different, I mean, there's 4 large developments, billions of pounds of investment into London, and you have scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions, and maybe you could talk about how you're going to be working on scope 3 carbon emissions and how that would impact your delivery of that. So just so everybody understands what scope 3 is, it means that all of their employers that they work with down the way, how much emissions do they have? And so how will you include the third sector into developing a plan to work with your delivery supply chain? So those are my 2 questions for those 2.
Thank you. We'll just take the other question and then we'll come to responses.
Just a question I want to ask. How do you believe people at a grassroots level and groups who are usually not listened to or are marginalized can actually make a difference and make an impact with the sort of work they want to do? I want to hear that. I would really like to hear that from a big corporation standpoint and from a small charity standpoint as well.
Thank you for those questions. Paul, can we start with you then on scope 3 and also on big corporations and what you think the role is?
Sure. So if let me have a go. I'm picking the question. So in terms, as you said, our carbon footprint comprises scope 1, 2, and 3. Simply, scope 1 is the fuels that we burn. So that might be things like diesels in plant machinery on a construction site. It might be gas being used in a gas boiler to heat a building. Scope 2 is the electricity, the power we consume on heating, lighting, cooling buildings, and so on. And scope 3 is pretty much everything else. Now, for us, we've made some big inroads in our scope 1 and 2. So, for example, this year, in terms of our European business, we've switched absolutely everything over to 100% renewable electricity and power across all of our offices and our projects and our assets. We're making some great headway in terms of our scope 2. So we've introduced a policy to phase out, to eliminate all use of red diesel on our construction business this year. So we're on track to deliver that. So there should be no diesel on our sites from January next year. But the proverbial elephant in the room, of course, is the scope 3, which actually represents something over 90% of our total carbon footprint. And that's made up of basically things that happen upstream. So in other words, the things that go into creating buildings and places that we're responsible for. The biggest chunk of that by far is the materials that go into buildings. So if you take steel and concrete, obviously 2 big components, each of those is responsible for circa 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if steel or concrete was a country, it would be 3rd most polluting country in the world. So that's a pretty big deal. And then you've got a whole bunch of other things like glass and aluminium and so on and so forth, and timber. So what we're trying to do, and then the other bit of our scope 3 is what happens downstream. So when we hand over our buildings to our tenants and our customers, how do they use, what energy do they use in those buildings that continues to create a carbon footprint as those buildings are operated for hopefully decades, or more to come. So, as I say, probably the hardest bit in all of that is dealing with the materials. We're a big builder, right? We build big places all around the world. In terms of steel, globally, we use close to 60 Eiffel Towers worth a year. Actually, that's a bit of a drop in the steel ocean, but nonetheless, it's still quite a lot. So, what we're trying to do is to work with organizations, collaborative organisations, with NGOs, with other companies to drive demand for change in those sectors. So there's organisations like Responsible Steel and Steel Zero. We're now looking at Concrete Zero, and there are a host of other initiatives looking to transform those sectors to low and ultimately zero carbon materials, which is to do with how they produce the energy that is used in their production and so on and so forth. And we'll also probably be seeing a rapid acceleration in the use of naturally low carbon materials like timber, which of course actually absorbs carbon dioxide as the tree is grown to produce the timber. Clearly it's critical that timber is produced in a sustainable way, is harvested in a sustainable way, both in terms of its impacts on nature, but also in terms of local communities, that it benefits local communities. So those are some of the things that we're doing. I've kind of forgotten the second part of your question, but I think more broadly, and let me have a go, is that what we can do is, the built environment overall represents about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions in the entire sector. It's a very fragmented, it's a very complex sector. It requires a great deal of collaboration with lots of different other actors. And absolutely there are opportunities for us to diversify our supply chain. So one of the other targets we have, for example, is to increase the amount of money that we spend with social enterprises. And we're seeing a steep increase in the amount of business that we can give to local businesses and local enterprises in delivering on some of these big projects. But by all means, remind me if there's another bit of the question I haven't answered.
Yeah, that was it. It was just that 90% of your emissions are coming from your scope 3. What are you going to do? What are your commitments? And number 2, how are you going to include the people next to you there in the wider third sector into helping you deliver? Because you're looking at 4 to 15-year delivery plans. You're going into communities, you're asking Camden and the population of Camden and other places to come on board with your projects, hiring out massive advertising campaigns, but you have the greatest advertising campaign of all, which is truth and trust with the community, which has already been delivered and developed. So how are you going to work with them is really the question.
Yeah, I don't think there's a neat answer to that other than that we are absolutely committed to work with them. As I said, through the work that we're doing in partnership with Camden and UCL through the Good Life Houston, that's a minimum of 10 years, and I would expect it to go beyond that. Working with citizen scientists, so people who we've trained to engage with us to understand the process we're going through, so that we can get very direct feedback from people in the local communities, understanding what they value about these places, what they'd like to see change in these places, and how we can incorporate that into the designs and the planning as we go forward. And that will have to be an iterative process. No doubt we'll make mistakes, we'll get some things wrong, and we'll get some feedback so that in latter phases we can improve as we go along. But it is that fundamental commitment. At the end of the day, we can't, working at the scale that we're working and the period of time we're working, at the end of the day, people will judge whether we did what we said we were going to do, whether they felt listened to. Obviously, we can't meet everybody's needs all of the time. There will always be some give and take. But I think what we've learned is we're getting better at listening. There was a project that we led, that we kicked off, initiated about probably 3 years ago now, a thing called the Loneliness Lab. And we worked with a whole array of organisations trying to understand the phenomenon, the epidemic of loneliness. And of course, this was before the pandemic, when everything got so much worse. And we recognised right from the beginning, we didn't understand what led to loneliness, but we knew that we had a role to play because we were helping to design places. And the question for us was, is it possible to design out loneliness in a place? What does it take? And we spent basically the best part of 2 years, including in Camden, working with many, many organisations here listening to people with lived experience of loneliness, people who had academic expertise in loneliness and so on and so forth, so that we could use that learning to inform what we do going forward. And I think we've got to take lessons from things like that to apply to all the different aspects of our placemaking.
Thanks, Paul. Ryan, very quickly and very briefly, if you could answer the question on ESG, that would be great.
I'll try. You're right in saying that historically it's been more E than S and G. I'll go even further to say that in the E for environment, it's very much mitigation and hardly ever even adaptation. So only 10% of climate finance goes towards adaptation, which is nature-based solutions, and actually making sure that we're fit for the coming weather conditions that we are going to experience, even if we are mitigating. Social has seen a large growth in the last couple of years because of COVID. So issuance of social bonds, which are finance instruments that then use the funds raised to help people in health conditions, increased tenfold last year. But can I say a bit more? Yep. To add to that, the bigger issue with all of E, S, and G is that it's almost impossible to tell what they're actually investing it into. You're trusting what the company's reporting on. So the work I'm leading on taxonomy work at the Green Finance Institute, that is going to allow firms to say, a framework to say what is actually green, and all of us can then hold them to account and see, okay, so I can compare you to the other firm and see how green you are compared to them. Unfortunately, to your ESG question, that's mainly focused on the E at the minute, but perhaps that will also expand to the S and G in the future. But being able to have the transparency and hold them to account is the most important thing, because otherwise commitments don't really mean anything.
Thanks, Ryan. We are done with the audience question session. We do have...
The lad asked a question.
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
Sure,
I think, yeah.
My question was, how can community groups at a grassroots level do the most they can to actually make an impact? Because I can understand when it comes to policy and decisions at a higher level, it does take time. But what are the mistakes grassroots level communities are making, and what can they do? What can they do to actually make an impact?
Yeah, thank you. Benaifa, do you want to?
Yeah, as long as we are financially able to keep going, we can do the work. It's as simple as that. So, for example, the National Lottery Fund, a project we run specifically for Bangladeshi older women. So these are women who have multiple barriers, language, culture, a lot of isolation. Many of them haven't left the council estates that they were brought into as daughter-in-laws. And through this work, we collaborate with Global Generation. So Global Generation are able to have their setting that we can step into. So they've got funding for that. We've got funding to access these women. And the things that they do, the planting, the biodiversity, the stories, they want to, through that, they wanted to go swimming. They wanted to remember what it was like when they swam in lakes and rivers. And they can tell you that now, when they go back to Bangladesh, things have changed. They've got the stories. They deeply understand the climate issues. And within them, they've probably got solutions that we don't even come anywhere near tapping into. But come December, that lottery funding is ending. And I don't know what we're going to do with those women.
Just to add on to that answer, I think it reminds me of my own journey when I was a first year student at UCL. People my age just weren't interested in climate action. So I had to make it as if it was a cool trend, attracting them as if this was something that would good look on their resumes or for their internships or their jobs. That's what they were attracted to. They didn't really care about the environment because how was it relevant to them? So it is, building those bridges to connect with the individual person and putting pressure on the local authority.
Thanks, Eliza. Ryan, very quickly.
If you have the time, educate yourself, educate everyone around you, call them out when they're talking about climate delay, when they're talking about climate inaction, tell them that we can achieve what we want to do, hold your local politicians to account, and hold big corporations to account. There are companies such as Share Action where you can see what they're doing, you can buy a couple of shares in a company or through them, and you can influence these larger corporations, and that comes from the grassroots. There are plenty of ways to do it. Just make sure that you take time to educate yourself and educate people around you.
Thank you so much. That was quick. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the really important questions that were raised today and the challenging questions that were raised. I do want to acknowledge that these are big questions and tough to answer very quickly in a panel discussion like this. So I'm hoping we can continue having these conversations as we move to the networking sort of session, and that this can be the start to more sustained conversations on issues that are really important. I have one final question. Do we have time? Okay, great. Which is just a closing round of reflections, which is on what is the one thing your organization will do over the next year in response to climate change and also the more real challenges of people surviving and working on issues of climate justice and social justice. Ryan, can we start with you?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky to say one thing because it's in the name. Everything we do is green. So everything that we're doing is work towards this goal. One thing that I personally will do is what I've just said over here in this advice. I'll keep going out of my way to educate people about the fact that we need public finance to step up, we need private finance to step up, and that we can achieve this, and that we need to make sure that marginalised communities come with us. So I will keep trying to educate people, I guess.
Thanks, Ryan. Benaifa.
The fantastic organisations, grassroots and small to medium-sized charities in Camden, they will all keep doing what they're doing. We will keep reaching those minoritized communities, and we will we'll keep addressing the barriers that they have so that they can develop some sense of agency within themselves. And currently, discreetly, we will bring up the climate issue. It has to be done discreetly because, as I said before, it's not relevant when you cannot put food on the table. And then, you know, depending on what the government does and what they give the council and what the council can give us, we will build on that work.
Thanks, Benaifa. Elisa.
20% waste reduction for every person. And so we're logging this out in a very accountable manner across 8,000 members all over the UK and even internationally. So they're going to log this on and they're going to decide how they're choosing to deduct 20% of their waste annually. Lots of interesting ways that, you know, revolve all around from their fashion choices to their travel habits to what they're eating. So I'm really excited to see what our 8,000 members are going to do.
Thanks, Elisa. Paul.
I guess just quickly, two things. One is that we will absolutely commit to be transparent about how we're doing on our journey to zero carbon, and we'll share with our partners and our competitors how we're doing, the things that work and the things that don't, because I think we've all got to share if we're going to get anywhere on this particular race to zero. And the other thing is what I've already said, which is our absolute commitment to listen to local people in the places that we're working.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, everyone. We're drawing this to a close now. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you for the challenging questions. And thank you to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chandrima and the panelists. Thank you, everyone, for coming along tonight. That was a really fascinating discussion, and in fact, the whole event has shifted from that kind of institutional, intergovernmental ambition at COP down to the reality on the ground in Camden. There are really some really strong issues that people are feeling, and the need that we have as a local authority to kind of bridge that gap feels more important than ever. I think Lend-Lease are going to be doing their bit in Euston by the sounds of things, which is great, and I think our Future Neighbourhoods funding that was mentioned at the start for Somerstown will also be a great fillip for that area, bringing in some much-needed investment to help show how you can really deliver a climate-ready community in a way that it also lines up strongly with this theme of climate justice and social justice that we've heard tonight. So just a big thank you to everyone who's come here tonight. Also to our hosts, Samsung, to Chandrima for chairing the panel discussion, and our speakers on the panel. Thank you very much for coming, all of you. Great to hear you. There are some other thank yous too. Feast With Us, who have got surplus food, fresh surplus food, that they've prepared into some tasty morsels for you all. We also have St Mary's Brewery here, who brew their own beer. So have a beer or a soft drink if you prefer. Thank you to Club 02, who produced the reusable packaging for the food. Thank you to Think and Do Camden. Thank you to Argent. Thank you to the Wesley Hotel as well. And most importantly, thank you to all of you who've come tonight. Like I said, it's just absolutely fantastic to see so many people in real life again. And also, no doubt, to have quite a few still sitting at home at their screens, no less important. But thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the evening. Like I said earlier, one final thing, is that we will put on this screen now these case studies of community climate action, which I really would encourage you all to dig into. And also, please go and see the little sort of showcases we have around the room too. Dig into the detail of those. Thank you, everyone.